Whispers of Mamayev Kurgan. The wind carries whispers across Mamayev Kurgan tonight. Whispers that speak of winter mornings when breath froze in the air and the city below stretched out like a broken promise along the Volga's edge. If you stand here now, on this hill that rises 102 meters above the river, you might think you're looking at just another Russian memorial. The towering statue of Mother Russia dominates the skyline, her sword raised against an endless sky. But beneath your feet, beneath the carefully tended grass and the marble steps, lies something far more complex than any monument can capture. This is where the mathematics of war collided with human will in ways that still puzzle military historians today. This is where the German 6th Army, arguably the finest fighting force in the world in 1942, found itself trapped not by superior numbers or better equipment, but by something far more elusive: the accumulated weight of 10,000 small decisions, each one seemingly logical, each one leading inexorably toward catastrophe. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine this place in September of 1942. The summer offensive that Hitler called Operation Blue has carried German forces deeper into the Soviet Union than ever before. Army Group South has split into two massive pincers, one driving toward the oil fields of the Caucasus, the other wheeling northeast toward a city that bears Stalin's name. From a strategic perspective, Stalingrad shouldn't matter. It's an industrial center, yes, but the real prize lies hundreds of kilometers to the south, in the oil fields of Baku and Grozny. Yet here, on this hill, the logic of grand strategy begins to fracture under the weight of something more immediate, more personal. General Friedrich Paulus, commanding the German 6th Army, understands the broader objectives. His forces are supposed to secure the Volga crossing, cut the river traffic that supplies the Soviet war effort, then wheel south to support the drive toward the Caucasus. Clean, efficient, the kind of operation that German staff officers excel at planning. But Mamayev Kurgan changes everything. From a purely tactical standpoint, you can see why. The hill dominates the entire city. Artillery observers positioned here can direct fire across the industrial district, the residential areas, even the ferry crossings where Soviet reinforcements struggle to cross the Volga under cover of darkness. Whoever controls this high ground controls Stalingrad. It's that simple, and that complicated. The complexity lies in what military theorists call the tactical trap. Every position on Mamayev Kurgan that offers good observation also offers perfect exposure to counter-battery fire. Every bunker that provides protection blocks the very sight lines that make the position valuable. The Germans discover this in the most painful way possible, by taking the hill, losing it, retaking it, losing it again. 7 times the summit changes hands in September alone. But it's not just the hill itself that creates the trap. It's the way the hill connects to everything else. The way it draws forces like a magnet, concentrating combat power in a space barely large enough for a battalion. When both sides need those forces, spread across a front that stretches for thousands of kilometers. The Germans commit the 295th Infantry Division to taking Mamayev Kurgan, then elements of the 71st Infantry Division, then parts of the 24th Panzer Division, whose tanks were designed for sweeping movements across open steppe, not grinding urban warfare among ruins and rubble. Each commitment seems logical. The hill is important. The previous attack came close to succeeding. Just one more push, one more battalion, one more day of artillery preparation. General Paulus watches his combat strength drain away into this single objective. But what choice does he have? You cannot leave an enemy-held observation post in your rear. You cannot advance deeper into the city while Soviet artillery observers on Mamayev Kurgan direct fire onto your supply lines. The Soviets face the same dilemma, but with a crucial difference. General Vasily Chuikov, commanding the 62nd Army, doesn't need to take territory. He only needs to hold it. His defensive positions on the reverse slope of Mamayev Kurgan are invisible to German observers in the city below, but they offer perfect fields of fire across the approaches. More importantly, they're supplied by night across the Volga, a dangerous crossing, but one that the Germans cannot completely interdict as long as Soviet forces hold positions along the riverbank. This is where the mathematics of attrition begin to favor the defense. Every German attack up the slopes of Mamayev-Kurgan must advance across open ground. Every Soviet counterattack moves from prepared positions through terrain they know intimately. The Germans possess superior training, better equipment, more experienced officers, but none of these advantages matter when the tactical situation negates them. Consider the problem facing a German company commander ordered to take the summit. His men must advance uphill, across ground swept by machine gun fire, against positions that have been reinforced and improved with each previous attack. He has artillery support, but the Soviet positions are so close to his own forward elements that effective fire missions risk hitting his own troops. He has air support, but the Luftwaffe is already stretched thin across the entire Eastern Front, and close air support in urban terrain requires precision that's difficult to achieve with the technology of 1942. Meanwhile, his Soviet counterpart fights from positions that have been prepared for exactly this kind of attack. His machine gun nests are positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. His mortars are pre-registered on the likely approach routes. Most importantly, his supply lines run downhill toward the Volga, while the German supply lines stretch back through a city that's increasingly dominated by rubble, collapsed buildings, and Soviet sniper positions. The snipers, that's another layer of complexity that transforms Mamayev-Kurgan from a conventional military objective into something approaching psychological warfare. The hill offers perfect hide sites. Ruined buildings, shell craters, even the rubble itself creates shadows and concealment that a skilled marksman can exploit. But more than that, the confined nature of the fighting means that every casualty is visible to his comrades. Every supply party that doesn't return. Every messenger who disappears between positions. This is where individual skill begins to matter more than organizational superiority. The German army of 1942 is a magnificent instrument of war, but it's designed for mobile operations, for the kind of combined arms warfare that swept across Poland and France. Urban combat, particularly the close-quarters fighting that develops around Mamayev-Kurgan, rewards different skills. Patience over speed, stealth over firepower. The ability to read terrain and understand sightlines becomes more valuable than the ability to coordinate complex maneuvers. Soviet forces adapt to this environment more quickly, partly because they have no choice, but also because the Red Army has been learning hard lessons about German tactical superiority for more than a year. They cannot match German combined arms coordination. They cannot match German air support or artillery techniques. But they can match German individual soldiers in close combat, particularly when the fighting takes place in conditions that negate German technological advantages. The weather adds another variable that no staff officer can fully calculate. September gives way to October, and the first snow begins to dust the slopes of Mamayev-Kurgan. This should favor the Germans. Winter warfare is supposed to be a German specialty, and the Wehrmacht has had time to prepare winter equipment after the disasters of the previous year. But the snow also conceals Soviet positions, makes movement more difficult for attacking forces, and creates conditions where small unit actions become more important than large-scale coordination. By November, the tactical situation around Mamayev-Kurgan has become a perfect microcosm of everything that's going wrong with German strategy in the east. Forces that should be advancing toward the Caucasus are instead grinding away against a single hill. Equipment that should be maintained and preserved for mobile operations is being worn down in static warfare. Most critically, the initiative, that intangible advantage that allows a military force to dictate the terms of engagement, is slowly passing to the Soviets. General Paulus understands this. His staff officers understand it. Even Hitler, 1,500 kilometers away in his various headquarters, begins to grasp that something fundamental has changed in the character of the Eastern Front. But understanding the problem and solving it are very different things. The tactical logic that draws German forces toward Mamayev-Kurgan remains compelling. The hill still dominates the city. Soviet observers still direct artillery fire from its slopes. German forces still cannot advance safely while the high ground remains in enemy hands. And so the battle continues. Attack and counterattack, advance and withdrawal, a deadly mathematics that consumes men and equipment at rates that would have seemed impossible during the mobile campaigns of 1940 and 1941. Each day brings new tactical problems. Each night brings Soviet reinforcements across the Volga. Each week brings the German Sixth Army closer to a crisis that its commanders can sense but cannot yet fully articulate. The whispers that carry across Mamayev-Kurgan tonight speak of all these things, of decisions made in desperate circumstances, of tactical brilliance negated by strategic confusion, of individual courage displayed in conditions that no training manual could adequately prepare soldiers to face. But perhaps most of all, they speak of transformation, the way a single hill became the focal point for a battle that would reshape not just the Eastern Front, but the entire trajectory of the Second World War. Eyes in the ruins, the transformation of Mamayev-Kurgan into a battlefield of attrition created an environment uniquely suited to a particular kind of warfare, one that required not the thunderous advance of tank columns or the coordinated movement of infantry battalions, but something far more intimate and deadly. In the shattered landscape of Stalingrad, where every building had become a fortress and every street corner a potential killing ground, the sniper emerged as perhaps the most psychologically effective weapon in the Soviet arsenal. The training of a Soviet sniper began long before the rubble-strewn streets of Stalingrad, in the forests outside Moscow, in the steppes of Ukraine, in hunting lodges that had been requisitioned for military purposes. Young men and women learned the fundamental mathematics of precision shooting. They studied ballistics tables until they could recite the trajectory drop of a 7.62mm round at 400 meters. They practiced breathing techniques that would allow them to slow their heart rate to barely 40 beats per minute, creating those crucial seconds of absolute stillness between heartbeats when the perfect shot could be taken. But the technical skills, demanding as they were, represented only the foundation of sniper training. The true art lay in developing what their instructors called the hunter's patience, that ability to remain motionless for hours, sometimes entire days, waiting for a single moment of opportunity. This was not merely physical discipline, though the ability to control bodily functions and ignore discomfort was certainly essential. It was a complete mental transformation, the cultivation of a predatory mindset that could maintain absolute focus while simultaneously processing dozens of environmental variables. The camouflage techniques employed by Soviet snipers in Stalingrad represented centuries of Russian hunting tradition adapted to urban warfare. They learned to read the light patterns created by destroyed buildings, understanding how morning shadows would shift throughout the day, how the angle of sunlight filtering through broken windows would change their concealment requirements. A sniper might spend an entire night carefully arranging debris to create what appeared to be just another pile of rubble, but which actually provided perfect sight lines to 3 different German positions while offering multiple escape routes. The ghillie suits they constructed were masterpieces of improvised engineering, using materials scavenged from the ruins, scraps of fabric torn from curtains, pieces of wire pulled from destroyed machinery, even human hair collected from abandoned barbershops. They created camouflage that could render them virtually invisible at distances of less than 50 meters. Each suit was unique, tailored not just to the individual sniper's body, but to the specific environment where they intended to operate. The selection of a sniper's nest required the same meticulous attention to detail that a chess master might apply to studying an opponent's opening moves. The ideal position offered multiple criteria that had to be balanced against each other: clear fields of fire, concealed approach routes, structural integrity of the hiding place, and perhaps most importantly, the psychological profile of the area. Experienced snipers learned to think like their targets, to understand the routes that German soldiers would instinctively choose when moving between positions, the times of day when enemy activity peaked, the behavioral patterns that emerged from prolonged urban combat. The mental discipline required for this work cannot be overstated. A sniper might occupy the same position for 72 hours straight, moving only to adjust their rifle by millimeters or to take carefully rationed sips of water. They developed an almost supernatural awareness of their immediate environment, learning to distinguish between the sound of settling rubble and the footstep of an approaching enemy, between the whistle of wind through broken masonry and the distant report of rifle fire. This heightened sensory awareness came at a psychological cost. Many snipers reported a strange dissociation from their surroundings. a feeling that they existed simultaneously in the immediate tactical situation and in some broader, almost philosophical space where individual human lives became abstract elements in a larger strategic equation. They spoke of entering what they called the quiet place, a mental state where external distractions faded away and their entire consciousness focused down to the precise alignment of crosshairs on a target. The sniper's nest became both sanctuary and prison. Within its carefully constructed boundaries, they enjoyed a degree of safety unavailable to other soldiers in Stalingrad. The combination of concealment and distance meant that they could operate for weeks without direct enemy contact. But this safety came at the price of complete isolation. Unlike infantry soldiers who shared their dangers and their small victories with comrades, snipers worked alone, making life and death decisions without consultation, living with the accumulated weight of individual kills in a way that soldiers in conventional units rarely experienced. The equipment they carried reflected this isolation. Beyond their rifles, typically the Mosin Nagant Model 9130 with a PU scope, they carried detailed logbooks where they recorded not just confirmed kills, but wind conditions, light angles, ammunition performance, and behavioral observations about enemy movement patterns. These logs became invaluable intelligence resources, but they also served a psychological function, providing a structured way to process the intense mental demands of their work. The relationship between sniper and rifle achieved an intimacy that bordered on the mystical. They learned the individual characteristics of their weapons with the precision of a concert pianist learning a new instrument. They could compensate for minute variations in barrel temperature, adjust for the slight drift that occurred after firing multiple rounds, even account for the way humidity affected the trajectory of their ammunition. The rifle became an extension of their body, its weight and balance as familiar as their own heartbeat. Perhaps most remarkably, they developed an intuitive understanding of human behavior under extreme stress. They learned to predict when a German soldier would expose himself to sniper fire, recognizing the patterns of fatigue, overconfidence, or simple human error that created targeting opportunities. They studied the psychology of their enemies with the dedication of academic researchers, noting how different units responded to sniper harassment, how individual soldiers adapted their behavior after witnessing sniper kills, how the mere knowledge of sniper presence affected German tactical decisions. The effectiveness of sniper operations in Stalingrad extended far beyond the simple mathematics of confirmed kills. Each successful engagement created ripple effects that influenced German behavior across entire sectors. Soldiers began moving differently, taking longer routes, avoiding certain areas entirely, developing the kind of hypervigilant anxiety that degraded overall combat effectiveness. Supply operations became more complex and time-consuming as drivers learned to vary their routes and timing. Even senior officers found their tactical options constrained by the knowledge that a single exposed moment could prove fatal. In this strange, intimate form of warfare, the sniper's nest represented more than just a tactical position. It became a place where individual skill and patience could influence the broader strategic picture, where one person's ability to remain perfectly still for hours could contribute to the defense of an entire city. In the ruins of Stalingrad, among the broken concrete and twisted steel of Mamayev Kurgan, these solitary hunters created their own quiet war within the larger chaos, a war of patience and precision that would help determine the fate of nations. And winter's embrace. As November deepened into December of 1942, the Volga began its annual surrender to winter's grip. Ice formed first along the riverbanks, thin sheets that crackled and shifted with the current, then thickened into solid barriers that would reshape the entire strategic landscape of Stalingrad. For the German Sixth Army, already committed to urban warfare they had never trained for, this seasonal transformation brought new dimensions of suffering that no staff college had prepared them to face. The temperature dropped to -20°C, then 30, then beyond the range where precise measurement mattered. What mattered was that rifle bolts froze solid. That breath formed ice crystals that could give away a sniper's position from 50 meters. That frostbite could claim fingers faster than Soviet bullets. And without fingers, even the most experienced marksman became just another casualty of winter's patient warfare. For the snipers who had made their homes in the ruins of Mamayev Kurgan, The cold presented challenges that went far beyond physical discomfort. Their craft depended on absolute stillness, on the ability to remain motionless for hours while waiting for a single perfect shot. But the human body rebels against such stillness in extreme cold. Blood retreats from extremities. Muscles contract involuntarily, the eye waters blurring the view through a telescopic sight at the very moment when clarity becomes most crucial. Soviet snipers developed techniques that bordered on the mystical. They learned to slow their breathing until their bodies entered a state resembling hibernation. They discovered that certain positions, certain angles of shelter, could trap just enough body heat to keep their trigger fingers functional. They found ways to warm their rifle bolts with their own body heat, without creating the telltale steam that would mark them for German counter-snipers who had learned to hunt the hunters. The German snipers faced different challenges. Their equipment, precision-engineered for European conditions, began to fail in ways that Zeiss optical engineers had never anticipated. Lens coatings cracked, telescopic sights fogged from the inside, creating useless reflective surfaces that turned precision instruments into liability markers. German winter uniforms, designed for the relatively mild winters of Western Europe, proved inadequate against the Siberian winds that swept across the steppes and funneled through Stalingrad's ruined streets with vengeance-seeking intensity. But perhaps the most profound change that winter brought was not tactical or technical, but psychological. The ruins of Stalingrad, already transformed into an alien landscape by months of bombardment, became something even more otherworldly under winter's influence. Snow filled the shell craters, creating deceptive smooth surfaces that concealed deadly drops. Ice covered the rubble, turning every movement into a calculated risk. The city became a crystalline maze where death waited not just from enemy action, but from the simple act of placing one's foot incorrectly on a frozen beam. In this environment, the war slowed to an almost geological pace. Attacks that might have taken hours in summer conditions now required days of preparation. Supply lines, already stretched to breaking points, became exercises in survival logistics. German quartermasters found themselves calculating not just ammunition and food requirements, but the precise caloric needs of soldiers whose bodies were burning energy at rates that defied normal planning assumptions. The Soviet defenders, fighting on their own soil with supply lines that crossed the frozen Volga, possessed certain advantages that became more pronounced as winter deepened. They understood the rhythms of Russian winter. They knew that the cold was not just an enemy to be endured, but a force that could be channeled, used, turned into a weapon against invaders who had never learned to think of weather as a tactical asset. Soviet engineers discovered that water, properly applied in sub-zero temperatures, could create defensive positions more effective than concrete. They would flood areas during the brief warming periods of midday, then allow the water to freeze overnight into barriers that German explosives could barely scratch. They learned to use the wind patterns created by the ruins, understanding how cold air moved through the destroyed city in predictable currents that could carry sound, scent, even the tiny particles of warmth that betrayed human presence to those who knew how to read such signs. For the individual soldiers on both sides, winter imposed a democracy of suffering that transcended national boundaries. German and Soviet alike faced the same fundamental challenge: how to remain human in conditions that seemed designed to strip away everything that separated civilized beings from mere survival mechanisms. Letters home, when they could be written at all, spoke less of military objectives and more of small victories against the cold. A pair of boots that still kept feet dry. A shelter that blocked the wind. A brief moment of warmth around a small fire that burned precious fuel, but provided the psychological anchor that kept men tethered to hope. The snipers, isolated by the nature of their work, experienced this winter isolation in concentrated form. Their hides became caves of endurance where time moved differently than in the world outside. Hours blended into each other in the grey light that passed for day during the brief winter afternoons. The boundary between sleeping and waking blurred when consciousness itself became a luxury that burned too many calories to maintain continuously. Yet in this apparent desolation, something remarkable emerged. The extreme conditions stripped away everything non-essential, revealing the core elements of human endurance that peacetime rarely demands. Soviet snipers discovered reserves of patience they had never known they possessed. They found that the human spirit, when pressed to its absolute limits, could adapt to circumstances that seemed beyond the boundaries of survival. German marksmen, far from their Bavarian forests and Prussian training grounds, learned that expertise meant nothing without the ability to reimagine everything they thought they knew. Those who survived the winter did so by abandoning the rigid doctrines of their training and embracing improvisation as a survival skill. They learned to think like their Soviet counterparts, to see the cold not as an obstacle to overcome, but as an environment to inhabit. The weapons themselves seemed to participate in this winter transformation. Rifles that had been precision instruments became temperamental partners that required constant attention, constant negotiation. A sniper's relationship with his weapon became almost animate. He learned its moods in different temperatures, understood exactly how long it needed to warm before it would fire reliably, knew the precise angle at which to hold it to prevent condensation from forming on the sight. As December deepened toward the winter solstice, Stalingrad entered a phase of warfare that had no precedent in military history. This was combat stripped to its absolute essence. Human will against human will, mediated by cold that treated all participants as equally unwelcome intruders in a landscape that belonged now neither to Germany nor to the Soviet Union, but to winter itself. In this crystalline desolation, where breath hung in the air like visible thoughts and every sound carried with supernatural clarity, the patient hunters continued their solitary war. Each shot fired not just at an enemy, but at the notion that human beings had limits that could not be transcended when survival demanded transcendence. Echoes of courage. In this crystalline desolation, where breath hung in the air like visible thoughts and every sound carried with supernatural clarity, the patient hunters continued their solitary war. Each shot fired not just at an enemy, but at the notion that human beings had limits that could not be transcended when survival demanded transcendence. Yet beneath this tactical chess game of life and death, a different story unfolded. One that military historians often overlook in their focus on strategic movements and casualty statistics. This was the story of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances, discovering reserves of courage they never knew they possessed. In the basement of what had once been Stalingrad's central department store, a makeshift field hospital operated under conditions that would have been unimaginable to medical professionals just months before. Dr. Elena Kozlova, a pediatrician who had never treated a gunshot wound in peacetime, now performed surgery by candlelight, her instruments sterilized in melted snow, her operating table a door torn from its hinges. The wounded came to her in endless streams, soldiers whose frost-bitten fingers could no longer grip their rifles, civilians caught in artillery barrages while searching for food, children separated from their families in the chaos of urban warfare. Each case presented impossible choices with inadequate resources. Yet Dr. Kozlova approached each patient with the same methodical care she had once reserved for treating childhood fevers. What sustained her was not medical training alone, but something more fundamental, the recognition that in preserving life, she was preserving hope itself. Her surgical notes, discovered decades later, reveal not just clinical observations, but philosophical reflections on the nature of human resilience. "Today I removed shrapnel from a boy's shoulder," she wrote. "He asked me if it would hurt. I told him yes, but that pain means you're alive to feel it." 3 blocks away, in the ruins of a textile factory, Senior Sergeant Viktor Petrov had established what military doctrine would classify as an observation post, but what had evolved into something approaching a small community. His position commanded excellent fields of fire across the German-held industrial district, making it strategically valuable. Yet it had also become a refuge for displaced civilians who had nowhere else to go. Petrov faced a tactical dilemma that no manual had prepared him for. Military logic dictated that civilians near combat positions created operational security risks and logistical burdens. But human logic, the deeper calculus of moral responsibility, suggested that abandoning these people would constitute a different kind of defeat entirely. His solution demonstrated the kind of adaptive leadership that emerges under extreme pressure. During daylight hours, when German observation made movement dangerous, the civilians remained in the factory's deepest basement levels. Silent, patient, understanding that their survival depended on absolute discipline. But during the long winter nights, when darkness provided concealment, the space transformed. An elderly mathematics teacher named Dmitry Volkov began conducting quiet lessons for the children, using charcoal on broken concrete to teach arithmetic and geography. A former seamstress repaired torn uniforms and civilian clothing, using thread salvaged from the factory's machinery. Most remarkably, a baker named Anna Stepanova had discovered that the factory's old boiler could be used to prepare small amounts of food, turning meager rations into something approaching actual meals. These small acts of normalcy became acts of resistance, not against the German army, but against the dehumanizing effects of total war itself. When Anna shared her carefully hoarded sugar to sweeten tea for a wounded soldier's birthday, when Dmitri taught children to count using spent shell casings as mathematical tools, when Dr. Kozlova hummed lullabies while treating patients, they were asserting fundamental truths about human dignity that no amount of military pressure could erase. The strategic implications of such behavior extended far beyond individual morale. Soviet commanders had initially worried that caring for civilians would compromise military effectiveness, that soldiers distracted by humanitarian concerns would prove less effective in combat. But field reports suggested the opposite dynamic was occurring. Units that maintained connections to civilian populations showed remarkable cohesion under stress. Soldiers who saw themselves as protectors rather than merely combatants demonstrated enhanced motivation and tactical creativity. The presence of non-combatants, particularly children and elderly people, served as a constant reminder of what they were fighting to preserve. This phenomenon was not unique to Soviet forces. German accounts from the same period reveal similar patterns, though complicated by the moral contradictions inherent in their position as occupiers. Lieutenant Klaus Weber, a Wehrmacht engineer tasked with clearing Soviet strongpoints, wrote letters home describing encounters with Russian civilians that challenged his preconceptions about the enemy. "Today, we found an old woman in a bombed apartment building," Weber noted. "She was caring for 3 wounded soldiers, 2 Russian, 1 of ours. When we arrived, she simply pointed to where she had hidden our man and asked if we had any medical supplies to spare. She spoke no German, we spoke no Russian, but her meaning was perfectly clear." Such encounters created profound cognitive dissonance for soldiers trained to view the conflict in terms of absolute ideological opposition. The reality of human suffering transcended political boundaries, creating moments of recognition that complicated simple narratives of us versus them. Weber's unit began leaving small gifts for this woman: tins of food, medical supplies, even a warm blanket. Not from any strategic calculation, but from an instinctive understanding that preserving her humanitarian example was somehow essential to preserving their own humanity. As winter deepened and the battle intensified, these networks of mutual support became increasingly sophisticated. Information flowed through informal channels that supplemented official military communications. Civilians who moved between different sectors carried messages, warnings about enemy movements, requests for specific supplies. Dr. Kozlova's medical network expanded to include German medics who had been captured but continued treating wounded prisoners. Professional medical ethics created a shared language that transcended national loyalties, a recognition that healing the injured served universal principles that existed above and beyond the immediate conflict. This collaboration was not without controversy. Soviet political officers worried about ideological contamination. German commanders feared intelligence breaches, yet the practical benefits were undeniable. Wounded soldiers received better care, medical knowledge was shared, and both sides developed more nuanced understandings of their opponents as human beings rather than abstract enemies. Perhaps most remarkably, these small communities began developing their own cultural traditions, rituals that provided psychological anchor points in an environment of constant uncertainty. Evening storytelling sessions where veterans shared tales from their home regions, improvised musical performances using makeshift instruments, even poetry readings where amateur writers shared verses composed during quiet moments between battles. These activities served multiple functions simultaneously. They preserved cultural memory in an environment that seemed designed to erase all traces of civilization. They provided psychological relief from the constant stress of combat, and they created shared experiences that bonded disparate groups into cohesive communities. The stories told during these gatherings would later become part of Stalingrad's collective memory, passed down through generations as testament to the human capacity for maintaining dignity under impossible circumstances. They remind us that even in humanity's darkest moments, even when survival itself seems uncertain, people continue to create meaning, to care for one another, to assert through small daily actions that some things remain more important than mere existence. In the frozen ruins of Stalingrad, surrounded by the machinery of industrial warfare, ordinary people discovered extraordinary reserves of compassion, proving that the human spirit, like the city itself, could endure far more than anyone had thought possible. The silent watch. The snipers returned to their positions as the pale winter light began its slow retreat across the Volga. In the aftermath of those small acts of human kindness, those brief moments when the war had seemed to pause, the reality of their vigil reasserted itself with quiet insistence. Vasily settled back into his nest among the twisted steel beams, his rifle finding its familiar rest against the concrete ledge. The scope, warmed by his breath during the brief respite, had already begun to fog again in the bitter air. He wiped the lens with practiced movements so automatic they required no conscious thought, leaving his mind free to settle into the peculiar rhythm of the watch. Across the contested ground, perhaps 200 meters away, Klaus adjusted his position behind the remnants of what had once been a factory wall. His carabiner 98K lay steady against its bipod, the barrel angled toward the Soviet positions with mathematical precision. Like his counterpart, he had learned to move with deliberate economy, every gesture calculated to preserve both warmth and concealment. The art of the sniper's watch was unlike any other form of warfare. It demanded a kind of meditation, a complete absorption in the present moment that could stretch for hours without break. Where other soldiers might advance or retreat, attack or defend, the sniper simply observed. Through his scope, Vasily studied the German positions with the patience of a scholar examining an ancient text. Every shadow held potential significance. Every irregularity in the rubble might conceal movement. His eyes traced the same sectors again and again, not searching for dramatic targets, but learning the subtle language of his environment. The wind patterns told their own story. He watched how the snow crystals danced differently around certain obstacles, how the smoke from distant fires bent and swirled, how even the smallest temperature variations created almost invisible currents in the air. These details would matter when the moment came to make a shot that might travel 300 meters through the chaos of urban warfare. Klaus, from his position, conducted his own silent study. The Soviet lines revealed themselves not through obvious movement, but through tiny inconsistencies. A patch of snow that seemed too perfectly arranged, a shadow that fell at an angle slightly different from the surrounding debris, the faint gleam of metal that appeared and disappeared as clouds passed over the weak sun. Both men had developed an almost supernatural awareness of time's passage. Without watches, without the normal rhythms of day and night to guide them, they learned to read duration in the gradual shift of shadows, the changing quality of light, the subtle evolution of wind patterns. An hour might feel like minutes when fully absorbed in observation, or it might stretch endlessly when the cold began to penetrate their carefully constructed shelters. The psychological challenge was perhaps greater than the physical one. The human mind, evolved for action and movement, rebelled against such prolonged stillness. Thoughts would drift, memories would intrude, the imagination would begin to populate empty spaces with phantom targets. Vasily had developed techniques to maintain focus. He would mentally catalogue every visible detail in his sector, then repeat the inventory an hour later, noting what had changed. A piece of cloth that had shifted position, fresh snow that had accumulated in a depression, the appearance of new tracks that suggested movement during the night. Sometimes he played mathematical games with the distances and angles. If a target appeared at the factory window, wind coming from the northwest at approximately 15 kilometers per hour, temperature minus 28 degrees, the bullet would drop, would drift, would arrive. He worked through these calculations not because he expected immediate action, but because the mental exercise kept his mind sharp and engaged. Klaus had his own methods of maintaining vigilance. He would study the Soviet positions and imagine the tactical thinking behind their placement. Why had they chosen that particular angle of fire? What did their positioning reveal about their assessment of German movements? He treated it as an intellectual puzzle, a chess match played with concealment and observation rather than pieces on a board. The silence between positions was rarely complete. The war continued around them, distant artillery creating a low rumble that seemed to emerge from the earth itself, the occasional crack of rifle fire from other sectors, the sound of aircraft passing high overhead, their engines creating a mechanical counterpoint to the wind. But within their immediate sphere, a different kind of quiet prevailed. It was the silence of intense concentration, of two skilled practitioners engaged in a deadly craft that required absolute patience. Neither would move carelessly. Neither would reveal their position through hasty action. The engagement, when it came, would last perhaps seconds. The preparation might continue for days. As the afternoon light began to fade, both snipers faced the daily transition that marked their profession. Darkness would bring different challenges, different opportunities. Night vision became paramount, the ability to distinguish between natural shadows and human movement, the skill to navigate by sound when sight became unreliable. Vasily checked his equipment with methodical precision, ammunition secured against the cold, rifle action protected from ice formation, escape routes mentally rehearsed. The sniper who survived was the one who planned for every contingency, who never allowed routine to dull the edge of preparation. Klaus performed his own ritual of readiness, scope covers positioned to prevent reflection, camouflage adjusted for the changing light conditions, alternative firing positions identified and memorized. The Germans had trained him well in the technical aspects of marksmanship, but Stalingrad had taught him lessons no manual could contain. The city itself seemed to settle into evening watchfulness. The ruins took on different shapes as shadows lengthened. Windows that had been clearly visible became dark voids. Passages that had seemed secure during daylight revealed new vulnerabilities. Both men understood that they were participants in something larger than individual combat. Their patient observation, their careful documentation of enemy movements, their occasional precise shots. These contributed to a vast network of information and interdiction that shaped the larger battle. Every hour of vigilant watching served the strategic purpose, even when no shots were fired. The temperature began its nightly descent toward the truly dangerous levels. Both snipers had learned to recognize the signs, the way their breath began to freeze more quickly, the increasing stiffness in their fingers despite the protective gloves, the subtle change in the quality of sound as the air grew denser. As darkness approached, they settled deeper into their positions, preparing for another night of silent competition. The vigil would continue, patient, methodical, and deadly, until one side or the other achieved the decisive advantage that had eluded both armies for so many weeks. In the growing twilight, Stalingrad held its breath, waiting to see what the darkness would reveal. Legacy of the Hill. The darkness that settled over Stalingrad that night would mark not just another phase in the sniper duel, but the beginning of the end for the German Sixth Army. Within weeks, the mathematical certainties that had drawn both armies into this grinding battle of attrition would reach their inevitable conclusion. The hill that had consumed so many lives, that had demanded such precise calculation of angles and wind drift, would soon bear witness to surrender. But even as the immediate tactical situation resolved itself, Mamayev Kurgan had already transcended its military significance. The rubble-strewn slopes, the shattered concrete, the countless foxholes and sniper positions had become something more enduring than any single battle. They had become a testament to human persistence under impossible conditions. In the decades that followed, as Stalingrad rebuilt itself and took the name Volgograd, the strategic importance of that central hill would be remembered in concrete and steel. The planners and architects who designed the memorial complex understood something profound about the nature of sacrifice, about how individual acts of courage accumulate into historical significance. The towering statue they erected, the Motherland Calls, rises 85 meters above the summit where Vasily and Klaus once measured distances in millimeters. At its base, an eternal flame burns in the Hall of Military Glory, where the names of defenders are inscribed in concentric circles around the flame. creating a geometry of remembrance that echoes the precise calculations once made through rifle scopes. The memorial's designers understood the tactical reality of what had occurred here. They preserved the essential truth, that this hill had been won and lost and won again through the accumulated precision of thousands of individual decisions. Each name on those walls represents someone who calculated angles, who measured wind speed, who chose the exact moment to advance or hold position. Walking the memorial today, visitors follow pathways that trace the old defensive lines. The landscaping preserves the essential topography, the sight lines that made certain positions valuable, the dead ground where movement became impossible. Even in peace, the hill reveals its tactical significance to those who understand how terrain shapes human behavior. The sniper positions that once housed men like Vasily have been replaced by contemplative spaces, areas designed for quiet reflection rather than deadly observation. But the fundamental relationship between observer and landscape remains unchanged. The same elevated perspectives that once provided fields of fire now offer visitors a chance to comprehend the scope of what occurred here. From the summit, the city spreads below in all directions, rebuilt, modernized, but still following the essential geography that made this location strategically vital. The Volga still flows along the eastern edge, still providing the natural boundary that made retreat impossible for the defenders. The industrial areas still cluster along the riverbank, still marking the objectives that drew German forces into urban combat. The memorial serves as more than commemoration. It functions as a kind of strategic education. School groups arrive regularly to study the battle's progression, to understand how individual tactical decisions accumulated into strategic outcomes. Military historians use the preserved sightlines to explain the mathematics of defensive warfare, how elevation advantages translate into tactical superiority. But perhaps most importantly, the memorial preserves the human scale of what occurred here. The individual names, the personal artifacts displayed in the museum, the photographs of faces both young and weathered, remind visitors that strategic outcomes emerge from countless individual moments of choice and courage. The sniper's craft, with its demands for patience, precision, and psychological endurance, becomes a metaphor for the larger battle. Just as Vasily and Klaus had to maintain focus through hours of motionless observation, the entire defense of Stalingrad required sustained attention to detail across months of grinding combat. In the growing twilight of memory, as the veterans of that battle pass into history, Mamayev Kurgan continues its vigil. The hill that once demanded such precise calculation of ballistic trajectories now hosts ceremonies that require equally careful attention to historical accuracy, to honoring sacrifice without glorifying violence, to preserving tactical lessons while acknowledging human cost. The eternal flame burns with the same constancy that once characterized the sniper's patient watch. Day and night, season after season, it maintains its position, a fixed point of reference in a world of constant change, and sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, when the memorial grounds are empty and the city below still sleeps, it's possible to sense something of that original tension, the weight of individual responsibility that once pressed down on men who measured their effectiveness in millimeters and heartbeats. The hill remembers, not just the grand strategic outcomes, but the intimate human moments that created them. The steady breathing, the patient calculation, the profound silence that preceded each decisive moment. In that remembrance, the legacy endures. Rest in peace, the hill remembers, not just the grand strategic outcomes, but the intimate human moments that created them. The steady breathing, the patient calculation, the profound silence that preceded each decisive moment. In that remembrance, the legacy endures. And now, as twilight settles over the Volga, the great river flows as it has for millennia, carrying with it the echoes of all those who stood their ground when standing seemed impossible. The water reflects not just the fading light of day, but the enduring light of human courage that once burned so brightly on these slopes. The strategic lessons of Stalingrad have been studied in military academies across the world, the tactical innovations catalogued and analyzed, the logistical challenges dissected and understood. But perhaps the most profound lesson lies in something far simpler. The recognition that beneath every grand strategic decision, every tactical maneuver, every calculated risk, there beat the hearts of individuals who chose to endure. The sniper's war ended as all wars do, not with the dramatic flourish that cinema might suggest, but with the quiet exhaustion of men who had pushed themselves beyond what they believed possible. Vasily would survive the battle, carrying with him the weight of precision and the knowledge that survival often comes down to the smallest margins, the steadiest hand, the most patient heart. Klaus, like so many of his comrades, would become part of the hill's memory. His professional skill acknowledged even by those who opposed him, his humanity recognized in the universal brotherhood of those who understand the true cost of conflict. The medical stations that Dr. Petrov and his colleagues established would eventually transform into proper hospitals, their improvised techniques becoming standard procedures, their desperate innovations saving lives far beyond the boundaries of this single battle. The children who found warmth in basement shelters would grow to become the architects of peace, their memories of shared humanity in the darkest hours serving as foundation stones for a more hopeful future. As night deepens over Mamayev Kurgan, the eternal flame flickers in its place of honor, not just commemorating the fallen, but celebrating the indomitable spirit that refused to surrender even when surrender seemed the only rational choice. The flame dances in the gentle evening breeze, its light reaching across decades to touch the hearts of those who visit this sacred ground, reminding them that courage is not the absence of fear, but the decision to act with honor despite that fear. The great memorial statue stands silhouetted against the starlit sky, her sword raised not in aggression, but in defiant protection of all that is worth defending. The motherland calls not for vengeance, but for remembrance, not for hatred, but for the kind of love that transforms ordinary people into extraordinary guardians of hope. Below, the Volga continues its ancient journey toward the Caspian Sea, its waters having witnessed the rise and fall of empires, the ebb and flow of human ambition, the eternal cycle of conflict and reconciliation. Tonight, those waters reflect only peace, the gentle lapping of waves against the riverbank creating a rhythm as soothing as a lullaby, as constant as the human heart, as enduring as the promise that dawn always follows even the darkest night. The tactical genius of the battle, the strategic implications that shifted the course of a world war, the technological innovations born from desperate necessity, all of these remain important lessons for students of military history. But for those who seek rest tonight, perhaps the most important lesson is simpler. That in our darkest hours, we discover not just what we're fighting against, but what we're fighting for. The hill sleeps now under a blanket of stars, the same constellations that once guided weary soldiers through the longest nights of their lives, now offering gentle light to peaceful dreams. The wind that once carried the sounds of battle now whispers only of hope, rustling through the memorial gardens where flowers bloom in soil that once knew only destruction, where life has triumphantly reclaimed every corner that death once claimed as its own. And in that triumph of life over death, of hope over despair, of human dignity over dehumanizing conflict, we find the truest victory of all, not measured in territorial gains or strategic advantages, but in the simple, profound recognition that the human spirit, when tested beyond all reasonable limits, reveals not its fragility, but its infinite capacity for renewal, for compassion, for the kind of quiet heroism that transforms battlefields into gardens and monuments to war, into sanctuaries of peace, where visitors from around the world come not to glorify conflict, but to honor the memory of those who, in their darkest hour, chose to be the light that guides us still toward a more hopeful dawn.